There is a line where an enemy becomes the only salvation. Between them lies the abyss of the past and the icy wind of the tower. Sometimes, hatred turns into obsession in just a single moment. The silence of Hogwarts after midnight was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the eardrums with the weight of centuries. For Hermione Granger, the silence was the loudest thing in the world. It was in the silence that the memories came, unbidden and sharp, sliding between the cracks of her occlumency shields like smoke under a doorframe. She lay in her four-poster bed, the velvet curtains drawn tight, creating a cocoon of crimson darkness. Her wand was under her pillow, a habit she couldn't break, a relic of a year spent sleeping on forest floors and in drafty tents. Her heart beat a frantic, hollow rhythm against her ribs, out of sync with the peaceful breathing of Ginny in the bed next to her. The war was over. The stone had been repaired, the blood scrubbed from the grout, the portraits rehung. But the castle remembered, and so did she. With a frustrated sigh that was swallowed instantly by the room, Hermione threw back the heavy quilt. The air in the dormitory was stale, recycled, too warm. She needed to breathe. She needed space where the walls weren't closing in. Slipping her feet into cold leather slippers and wrapping a thick knitted cardigan over her nightdress, she moved with the practiced stealth of a soldier. The floorboards of the Gryffindor Tower, usually so prone to creaking, seemed to recognize her tread and held their breath. She didn't take the invisibility cloak. Tonight, she didn't want to disappear. She wanted to feel real. She wanted to feel the stone, the drafts, the sheer undeniable reality of the castle standing tall. The portrait hole swung open without a password, recognizing the head girl's magical signature, and she stepped out into the corridor. The air here was different. It tasted of old stone, burning torches, and the faint metallic tang of the lake that always seemed to permeate the lower levels, creeping up through the dungeons. Hermione walked aimlessly at first, her fingers trailing along the rough masonry of the walls. The sensation grounded her, rough, cold, solid. She found herself gravitating towards the Astronomy Tower, perhaps seeking the sky, seeking the vastness that made human problems feel insignificant. The corridors were dim, lit only by the occasional sputtering torch or the pale, watery moonlight spilling through the high-arched windows. It was on the third-floor landing, near the trophy room, that the feeling first prickled at the base of her neck. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift in the air pressure, a subtle disturbance in the magical currents of the hallway. Someone was there. Hermione stopped dead, her hand instinctively flying to the pocket of her cardigan where her wand was stowed. She didn't draw it, but her fingers curled around the vinewood, seeking comfort. She held her breath, listening. Nothing. Just the distant settling of the castle's foundations and the wind whistling faintly against the window panes. "Is someone there?" she whispered. Her voice sounded too loud, too fragile in the cavernous dark. No answer. She shook her head, chiding herself. "Paranoia, Granger. It's just a ghost. Or Peeves." She began to walk again, but the sensation didn't leave. It intensified. It felt like a tether, a thin, invisible thread connecting her spine to something or someone behind her. It was a magnetic pull, a heaviness that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She wasn't being hunted. The intent didn't feel predatory. It felt observational, intense. She turned a sharp corner, intending to loop back towards the library, and stopped abruptly. She wasn't alone. At the far end of the long gallery, silhouetted against a massive window that looked out over the black, churning grounds, stood a figure. He was motionless, standing so still he could have been one of the marble statues, were it not for the fluid grace of the robes that settled around him. The moonlight washed him in silver, turning his platinum hair into a halo of cold light. Draco Malfoy. Hermione's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, audible sound. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He remained staring out the window, his hands clasped behind his back in that aristocratic posture that had been drilled into him since birth. The tension that flooded the corridor was immediate and suffocating. It wasn't the fiery, hex-flinging hatred of their earlier years. It was something colder, denser. It was the tension of two people who had seen the other side of death and had come back different. Hermione hesitated. The logical part of her brain, the prefect part, told her to turn around, to walk away. He was not breaking any rules. As a returning 8th year, he had privileges. And even if he were out of bed illicitly, did it matter? What was a curfew to people who had fought in a war? But she didn't move. She couldn't. There was something about the set of his shoulders, rigid, tense, as if he were holding up the weight of the ceiling, that pinned her to the spot. He looked isolated in a way that terrified her. It was an isolation she recognized in the mirror every morning. Slowly, carefully, she took a step forward, then another. The sound of her slippers on the stone was soft, but in the echoing gallery, it was a declaration of presence. "Malfoy," she said. He didn't jump. He turned his head slowly, his movement languid, almost weary. When the moonlight hit his face, Hermione felt a jolt in her chest. He looked wrecked. Oh, he was beautiful in that sharp, severe way of his. High cheekbones, pale skin, the immaculate cut of his black shirt. But his eyes were shadowed, rimmed with the bruising of sleeplessness that matched her own. His face was gaunt, the boyish softness completely eroded by the acid of the last 2 years. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. His grey eyes locked onto hers. There was no sneer, no curling lip, no mudblood, just a flat, exhausting emptiness that was far more unnerving than his anger ever had been. "Granger," he acknowledged. His voice was a rasp, low and dry, like dead leaves scraping over pavement. It sounded unused. "You're following me," she stated, though it came out more like a question. Draco turned his body fully towards her now. He was far away, perhaps 20 feet, but the distance felt negligible. The air between them hummed. "Don't flatter yourself," he said, but the bite was gone. It was a reflex, a muscle memory of an insult rather than a real one. "I was walking. You happen to be walking in the same castle. It's a large building, but the paths are finite." "I felt you," she insisted, taking another step. Why was she approaching him? She should be repulsed. She should be angry. But looking at him was like looking at an open wound. "Behind me, near the trophy room." He paused, his gaze dropping to her throat, then back to her eyes. He didn't deny it. "You're loud, Granger, even when you're trying to be quiet. You project anxiety. And you project darkness," she countered, crossing her arms over her chest, tightening the cardigan around herself. "I am the darkness," he murmured, almost to himself. He looked back out the window, dismissing her. "Go back to bed. The Gryffindor Tower is that way. Warm, safe, full full of heroes. The word heroes wasn't spat with venom, but with a self-deprecating bitterness that stung. "I can't sleep," Hermione admitted. The truth slipped out before she could check it. Draco's hands unclenched behind his back, hanging loose at his sides. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of the window, seeing her reflection standing behind him. "Neither can I," he said simply. The admission hung in the air, a fragile bridge between them. This was the enemy, the boy who had watched her get tortured in his own drawing room, the boy who had taken the mark. And yet, standing here in the blue-grey light, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a ruin, a crumbling structure trying desperately to remain standing. Hermione studied him. She noticed the way his left hand twitched, the fingers brushing against his forearm, scratching absent-mindedly at the fabric covering the dark mark. It was a nervous tick, a sign of the internal rot he was trying to hide. "Why are you out here, Malfoy?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Really?" He turned back to her, and for a second his mask slipped. She saw fear. She saw a deep, clawing panic that he was keeping leashed behind walls of occlumency, so thick she could almost feel the cold radiating from them. "Because the silence in the dungeons is too loud," he said, "and the ceiling feels like the lid of a coffin." Hermione felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the draft. She understood that. She understood the feeling of being buried alive by your own thoughts. "So, you follow me?" she pressed, trying to find the logic. "You were a focal point," he confessed, the words seemingly dragged out of him. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "You're alive, aggressively, annoyingly alive. It was easier to focus on your footsteps than on the things in my head." It was a twisted sort of compliment, or perhaps just a desperate utilization of her existence. He was using her as an anchor. "That's creepy, Malfoy." "It's survival, Granger," he shot back, his eyes flashing with a momentary spark of the old fire. "But I wouldn't expect you to understand the nuance." "I understand survival," she said sharply, stepping closer until she was only a few yards away. The smell of him hit her then. Expensive, crisp cologne, something like cedar and rain, mixed with the smell of old parchment and smoke. It was intoxicatingly clean amidst the musty castle air. He looked down at her. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe she just felt smaller these days. "Then survive somewhere else," he said, though he made no move to leave. He was looking at her hair, unruly and loose around her shoulders. His gaze felt physical, like a touch. It wasn't lecherous. It was fascinated, like he was seeing a species he thought had gone extinct. "I was heading to the Astronomy Tower," she lied. She hadn't been heading there specifically, but now she wanted to go. She wanted to be in the wind. Draco's expression shifted, a micro-expression of surprise, followed by something darker, more intense. He looked up towards the ceiling, as if seeing through the stone to the parapets above. "The wind is strong tonight," he noted. "It's coming from the north." "I like the wind," Hermione said. "It clears the head." Draco looked back at her, and for the first time the corner of his mouth twitched upwards. It wasn't a smile. It was a grimace of acknowledgement. "Go on then," he said, stepping aside, sweeping his arm in a mock gesture of chivalry that was laden with irony. "Don't let me keep the golden girl from her sky." Hermione hesitated. She should walk past him. She should go up the stairs and leave him in his gloom. But the pull was still there. The tension between them was like a taut wire, vibrating. She took a step towards the staircase that spiraled up to the tower, but she paused as she came parallel to him. She was close enough to touch him now. She could see the faint scar on his jaw, the way his pulse jumped in the hollow of his throat. She looked up into his eyes, searching for the malice she was used to. She found only a deep, churning grey ocean of regret. "Are you staying here?" she asked quietly. Draco looked at her, and the air seemed to vanish from the corridor. He looked at her lips, then her eyes. He seemed to be fighting a war within himself, the instinct to push her away versus the desperate human need to be near another living soul. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. He didn't explain. He didn't move away. Hermione nodded once, her throat tight. She turned and began to ascend the spiral stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear the soft, rhythmic click of expensive dragon-hide boots on the stone steps behind her. He was following her, and God help her. She was glad. The fear that had been her constant companion for months seemed to recede, replaced by a new, sharp and dangerous curiosity. The hate was there. The history was there. But tonight, in the dark, they were just two sleepless ghosts climbing towards the sky. The spiral staircase was a throat of stone, swallowing them whole as they ascended. With every turn, the air grew thinner, sharper, stripping away the stagnant warmth of the castle below. Hermione could hear nothing but the rush of her own blood in her ears and the rhythmic, deliberate strike of Draco's boots on the steps behind her. Click, click, click. He wasn't creeping. He wasn't hiding. He was simply following, a dark satellite caught in her orbit. The knowledge of his presence behind her, in the dark, should have terrified her. A year ago, it would have meant a curse to the back. But now it felt like a strange, perverse sort of guard. She reached the heavy oak door at the top of the tower and pushed. It groaned, a low protest of wood against iron hinges before swinging outward. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It was wild and untamed up here, a living thing that shrieked around the turrets and whipped her hair across her face in a chaotic, blinding curtain. Hermione stepped out onto the parapet, gasping as the icy air filled her lungs. It was exhilarating. It was violent. It was exactly what she needed. She walked to the edge, gripping the freezing stone balustrade with both hands. Below, the grounds were a sprawling abyss of shadows. The forbidden forest was a restless ocean of black treetops churning in the gale. The lake was a slab of obsidian, reflecting nothing. For a moment, she forgot him. She forgot the war, the nightmares, the empty chair at the breakfast table. She was just a speck of dust in the face of the storm. Then the wind shifted, and the scent of cedar and ozone washed over her. Draco moved to the railing. He didn't stand next to her. That would imply a camaraderie they didn't possess. But he was close, perhaps 6 feet away. Close enough that she could see the way the wind tore at his robes, billowing the black fabric around him like broken wings. He didn't look at her. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the stone, his pale hands clasping together, knuckles white. He looked out at the dark horizon, his profile sharp and severe against the bruised purple of the night sky. "It's going to rain," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind with a peculiar clarity. It was a statement of fact, devoid of emotion, yet it felt like an offering. Hermione looked at him, really looked at him, stripped of the castle's torches and the filtered safety of the great hall. Up here, in the raw blue light of the stars, he looked elemental. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the hollow of his cheek, the silver blonde strands of hair that had escaped his immaculate styling to whip around his face. "Let it rain," she replied, her voice snatched away by a gust. She turned back to the view, but her senses were now hyper-tuned to the right, to him. They stood in silence for a long time. It wasn't the comfortable silence of friends, nor the stony silence of enemies. It was a charged, vibrating silence. It was the feeling of standing next to a lightning rod during a storm, the anticipation of the strike. Hermione stole a glance at his hands. They were elegant, the fingers long and tapered. She remembered those hands pointing a wand at Dumbledore. She remembered them shaking. Now they were still, locked together, as if he were afraid of what they might do if he let go. "You're not wearing a cloak," he observed. He didn't turn his head. "I have a cardigan," she defended, though the wool was doing little to stop the biting cold from seeping into her bones. She suppressed a shiver, refusing to show weakness. "A cardigan," he repeated, the word dripping with his trademark drawl, though it lacked the usual venom. Gryffindor logic, bravery over basic survival instincts. "I didn't plan on coming up here," she snapped softly. "I didn't plan on company either. And yet, here we are." He turned then, resting his back against the stone railing, facing her. The wind caught his shirt, pressing the fabric against his chest, outlining the lean, jagged lines of his ribs. He looked starved. Not just for food, though he had barely touched his plate in weeks, but for something else, something vital. "Why did you follow me, Malfoy?" she asked again, the question torn from her by the wind. "Don't give me that poetry about footsteps and silence. Why are you here? With me?" Draco looked at her, his grey eyes darkening to the colour of the storm clouds gathering above. He looked exhausted, the mask of indifference cracking around the edges. "Because," he started, then stopped. He looked down at his boots, then back up, his gaze piercing. "Because you are the only thing in this castle that is real, Granger. Everyone else, they're tiptoeing, walking on eggshells, treating me like glass that's about to shatter or a bomb that's about to go off. They look at me with pity or fear." He took a step closer. The wind howled, louder now, a crescendo. "You don't," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that she felt in her chest more than she heard. "You look at me like you're waiting for me to make a move. You look at me with expectation, judgment, anger. It's grounding." Hermione's breath hitched. He was right. She didn't pity him. She didn't fear him. She saw him. She saw the wreckage, and she didn't look away. "I don't hate you," she whispered, the realization shocking her as the words left her mouth. "I should, but I don't." Draco's face twisted, a flash of pain so raw it made her want to reach out. "You should," he rasped. "It would be easier." The wind suddenly shrieked, a violent gust that slammed into the tower with the force of a dragon's tail. It caught Hermione off guard. Her hair whipped across her eyes, blinding her, and the force of the air pushed her hard against the stone balustrade. She stumbled, her slipper sliding on a patch of slick moss. For a heart-stopping second, gravity seemed to tilt. She flailed, her hand grasping for purchase on the wet stone, finding only air. A gasp tore from her throat. And then she was anchored. A hand, hard and cold and incredibly strong, clamped around her upper arm. Another hand slammed onto the stone railing beside her waist, boxing her in, shielding her from the precipice. Hermione froze. The wind was still roaring, but suddenly she was in the eye of the storm. Draco was there. He was right there. He had moved with the speed of a seeker, closing the distance in a blur. His body was pressed close to hers, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, a furnace against the chill night. He wasn't looking at the drop. He was looking at her. His hand on her arm was tight, his fingers digging into the wool of her cardigan, bruising in their intensity. He wasn't hurting her. He was holding her to the earth. Time seemed to warp, stretching thin and taut. Hermione looked up, breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Draco's face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. She could see the dilation of his pupils, swallowing the iris. She could feel his breath, ragged and warm, ghosting across her cheek. He smelled of rain, of cedar, and of something uniquely him. A sharp, metallic scent of magic and adrenaline. He didn't let go. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The animosity, the history, the blood status, it all evaporated, leaving only this: a man and a woman on a rooftop, the only two people awake in the world. Hermione felt a strange, terrifying pull in her gut, a desire to lean forward, to close the infinitesimal gap, to bury her face in the dark fabric of his robes and steal his warmth. Draco's gaze dropped to her mouth. It was a subtle movement, a flicker, but it sent a shockwave of electricity through her veins. His grip on her arm tightened, his thumb brushing inadvertently against the soft skin of her inner elbow through the knit. The touch burned. It was a brand. "Careful, Granger," he murmured. His voice was rough, wrecked. It wasn't a taunt, it was a warning. But who was he warning? Her or himself? He looked like he was in pain, like touching her was causing him physical agony, yet he couldn't bring himself to stop. The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken things, with the sheer, undeniable gravity of their shared trauma. Hermione looked back at him, her lips parted, unable to form words. She wanted to tell him to let go. She wanted him never to let go. "Draco," she breathed. The use of his given name seemed to snap him out of the trance. His eyes widened, a flash of panic replacing the intensity. He realized where he was. He realized who he was touching. He recoiled as if burned. He snatched his hand back, stepping away from her so abruptly that the cold air rushed into the space between them, leaving Hermione shivering violently. He turned his back to her, his shoulders heaving. He ran a hand through his hair, a frantic, disjointed gesture. "Go inside," he commanded, his voice harsh, strained. He sounded angry now, angry at the wind, angry at the tower, angry at the universe for pushing them together. "Malfoy, go!" he snapped, turning his head just enough for her to see his profile. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle feathered beneath the skin. "Before the rain starts, I don't want to carry you to the hospital wing." It was a dismissal, a reinstatement of the walls. Hermione stood there for a moment, her arms still tingling where he had gripped her. Her skin felt hot, marked. She looked at his back, rigid and defensive against the dark. She understood. He had come too close. He had let the mask slip, and he was terrified of what she had seen underneath. "Good night, Malfoy," she said softly. He didn't answer. She turned and walked back to the heavy oak door. Her legs felt unsteady, her pulse still racing. As she pulled the door open, the first drops of rain began to fall. Heavy, cold drops that splattered against the stone like tears. She glanced back one last time. He was still standing at the edge, staring into the abyss, letting the rain soak him to the bone. He looked like a statue of solitude, a gargoyle guarding nothing but his own regret. Hermione slipped into the stairwell and let the door close, shutting out the wind, the rain, and the boy who had saved her from falling, only to let her go. But as she descended into the darkness of the castle, she brought something with her, the ghost of his touch, burning on her skin, and the unsettling realization that for the first time in years, she didn't want to be safe. She wanted the storm. The portrait hole swung shut behind her, severing the connection to the dark, drafty corridors and sealing Hermione inside the Gryffindor common room. The sudden warmth hit her like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of heat radiating from the dying embers in the hearth. The room was empty, save for the scattered remnants of late-night studying, a forgotten quill on a table, a scarf draped over the back of an armchair, the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. It was safe here. It was familiar. It was red and gold and aggressively comforting. And Hermione felt entirely alien within it. She didn't go to the dormitory. She couldn't bear the thought of Ginny's soft, untroubled breathing or the suffocating velvet of her bed curtains. Instead, she moved toward the fireplace, sinking onto the rug before the grate. The stone beneath her was warm, a stark contrast to the icy parapet she had just fled. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs, curling into a tight defensive ball. But the position offered no shelter from her own mind. Her left hand drifted of its own accord to her right arm. Her fingers traced the wool of her cardigan, finding the exact spot where Draco's hand had clamped down. She could still feel it. It wasn't just a memory of pressure. It was a phantom sensation, a lingering brand of heat that seemed to have seeped through the knit and into the skin, into the muscle, into the bone. It was an imprint of desperation. He saved me. The thought was simple, logical, a reflex. Anyone would have done it. If Neville had been there, or Ron, or even a professor, they would have reached out. It was a basic human instinct to prevent a fall, but it hadn't felt like a reflex. Hermione stared into the glowing coals, replaying the moment in agonizingly slow motion. The way he had moved, blurringly fast, faster than thought. The way he had boxed her in, his body acting as a shield against the abyss. The way he had looked at her. There had been no hesitation in his eyes. No flicker of the prejudice that had defined their entire existence. For a terrifying, suspended second, he hadn't looked at her as a mudblood. He hadn't even looked at her as Hermione Granger, the war heroine, the know-it-all. He had looked at her as if she was something precious that was about to break, and he was the only thing holding her together. She shuddered, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. With trembling fingers, she pushed up the sleeve of her cardigan, then the sleeve of her nightdress underneath. She bared her left forearm to the firelight. The scar was there, mud blood, carved in jagged, ugly letters. It was silver now, healed but never gone, a permanent reminder of who she was to people like him. Bellatrix Lestrange had carved it. Draco had watched. She remembered his face that day in the manor, the terror in his eyes, the way he had looked sick, grey, shrinking into the shadows as his aunt tortured her. He hadn't helped her then. He had been a paralysed boy, choking on his own cowardice. So who was the man on the tower? The dissonance made her head ache. She tried to reconcile the two images, the boy who watched her bleed and the man who pulled her back from the edge. Logic dictated that he was dangerous. Experience dictated that he was broken. But her instincts were screaming something else entirely. Her instincts were telling her that the heat she felt radiating from him wasn't anger. It was a shared frequency, a resonance. "Stop it," she whispered to the empty room. Her voice was harsh, cracking the silence. "He's Malfoy. He's just Malfoy." She aggressively yanked her sleeve down, covering the scar, covering the skin that tingled with the memory of his touch. She needed to be rational. She needed to be cold. She couldn't afford to soften toward him. Softness got you killed. Softness was a luxury for people who hadn't fought a war. But as she stared into the dying fire, all she could see was the storm in his grey eyes and the terrifying realization that for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone in the dark. Far below the lake, the atmosphere was crushing. Draco didn't walk back to the dungeons. He stormed. His long strides ate up the distance of the stone corridors, his robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. The further he descended, the heavier the air became. The familiar dampness of the subterranean levels usually soothed him, a cold, pressurized embrace that kept the world at bay. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. He muttered the password to the blank stretch of stone wall. Absolution. And it ground open. The Slytherin common room was a study in shadows and green light. The massive windows looking out into the black lake were dark, the water murky and impenetrable. Occasionally, the tentacle of the giant squid would drift past, a silent leviathan in the gloom. It was quiet here, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of held breath. Draco didn't stop. He moved straight to the boys' dormitory, grateful that his status as a returning 8th year afforded him a private room. He slammed the door behind him and locked it with a sharp flick of his wand. Colloportus. He needed barriers. He needed locks. He needed to keep the world out, but more importantly, he needed to keep himself in. He moved to the small basin in the corner of the room. He turned the tap and icy water gushed out. He didn't bother to heat it. He plunged his hands into the freezing stream, scrubbing them together violently. He scrubbed until the skin turned red, until his knuckles ached. He was trying to wash it off. The sensation of her, the wool of her cardigan, the fragility of her arm beneath it, the warmth of her body as the wind pushed her against him. It was clinging to his skin like a contagion. Granger. He looked up, staring at his reflection in the mirror above the basin. He looked deranged. His hair was wind-blown, tangled from the storm. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown, frantically searching his own face for a sign of the madness he felt taking root. "What are you doing?" he hissed at the glass. "What the hell are you doing?" He had touched her. He had saved her. Why? He should have let her fall. No, that was the old voice. His father's voice, whispering in his ear about purity and blood traitors. He didn't want her dead. He hadn't wanted anyone dead for a long time. But he shouldn't have touched her. He had broken the cardinal rule of his existence: isolation. He was supposed to be the pariah, the fallen prince in the Tower of Silence. He was serving his penance in the shadows, waiting for the year to end so he could fade into obscurity. But she had looked at him. On the roof, with the wind tearing the world apart, she hadn't looked at the dark mark. She hadn't looked at the Malfoy name. She had looked at him. She had seen the ruin, and instead of recoiling, she had stepped closer. "I don't hate you." Her words echoed in the small stone room, louder than the water running in the basin. "I don't hate you." It was worse than hate. Hate, he understood. Hate was a clean, sharp blade. He could parry hate. But this strange, quiet curiosity, this absence of judgment, it was a poison. It was slipping past his defenses, disarming him, leaving him exposed. He turned off the tap with a savage twist. The water dripped. Plink, plink, plink. He leaned over the basin, gripping the porcelain edges until his fingers turned white. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to summon the occlumency walls. He tried to build the fortress in his mind, brick by brick, cold, unfeeling, impenetrable. Imagine the wall, Snape had taught him. Imagine the ice. But every time he tried to smooth the mortar, the image of her face intruded. Her eyes, wide and brown and flecked with gold. The way her lips had parted when he grabbed her. The smell of her, ozone and books, and something inexplicably sweet. It made him sick with want, and the want made him sick with guilt. How dare he? How dare he, of all people, want comfort from her? He was the reason she had scars. He was the reason she woke up screaming. He was the monster in her story. "You are nothing," he whispered to the reflection. "You are dust. You are the son of a failure." He pushed away from the sink and began to pace the small room, a caged animal. The adrenaline from the roof was souring into something bitter. Shame. He had let his guard down. He had been weak. He had sought her out like a moth to a flame, desperate for the heat, ignoring the fact that he was made of wax. He couldn't let it happen again. The seesaw in his chest tipped violently. The warmth he had felt on the roof was dangerous. It was a trap. If he let her in, if he let her see him, she would eventually see the rot at the core. She would see the cowardice he couldn't scrub away. And when she finally realized what he truly was, the look in her eyes would change from curiosity to disgust. And that would destroy him more completely than the Dark Lord ever could. He had to stop it. He had to kill it before it grew. Draco stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the room, the green light from the lake casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. He straightened his spine. He smoothed his features into the mask of indifferent boredom that had been his armor since he was 11 years old. He would fix this. Tomorrow. He would be cold. He would be cruel if he had to be. He would remind her of who he was. He would remind himself of who he was. He walked to the window and pressed his hand against the glass. The water outside was freezing, the cold seeping through to his palm. It numbed the lingering heat of her arm. No more, he vowed softly. He would rebuild the wall. He would board up the windows. He would starve this feeling until it died. But as he lay in his bed, staring up at the stone canopy, the sound of the rain far above on the surface felt like a secret language only the two of them spoke. And he knew, with a sinking dread, that the walls were already breached. The ghost was in the machine. and she was haunting him. The great hall was a cacophony of life, a stark, violent contrast to the silence of the Astronomy Tower. Hundreds of voices bounced off the enchanted ceiling, which today reflected a grey, sullen sky that threatened more rain. The air smelled of roasting pumpkin, strong tea, and the damp wool of student robes. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, wedged between Harry and Ginny. Harry was laughing at something Ron said, a piece of toast suspended halfway to his mouth, but the sound seemed to come from underwater. Hermione was present. She was nodding at the right intervals. She was smiling when the group smiled, but her consciousness was elsewhere. It was tethered to a point across the room at the far end of the Slytherin table. She didn't look. She didn't have to. She knew exactly where he was. She could feel him like a phantom limb, a persistent ache in the architecture of her day. Since the night on the tower, 3 days had passed. 3 days of absolute verbal silence. They hadn't exchanged a single word. They hadn't acknowledged the way he had pulled her back from the edge, or the way her skin still pricked with the memory of his grip. To the outside observer, nothing had changed. The war heroine and the Death Eater were worlds apart. But beneath the surface, the dynamic had shifted into something obsessive. Hermione took a sip of her tea, her eyes scanning the rim of her cup. She caught a flash of platinum blonde hair. Draco was sitting alone, despite the crowded bench. There was a visible perimeter of empty space around him, a buffer zone created by the other students' fear and his own prickly exclusionary aura. He wasn't eating. He was dissecting a green apple with a silver knife, the movements surgical, precise. As if he felt her attention, his hand paused. He looked up. The collision of their gazes was instantaneous and physical. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a lock. Across the heads of laughing first years and chattering Hufflepuffs, the noise fell away. His eyes were guarded, the grey flat and impenetrable. But he didn't look away. He held her gaze with a challenge, a silent acknowledgement of the secret they shared. "I see you watching me," the look said. "I am watching you back." "Hermione!" Ginny's voice cut through the connection. Hermione blinked, the spell breaking, the noise of the hall rushing back in. "Sorry?" Hermione asked, turning to her friend, though her pulse was thumping a frantic rhythm against her collarbone. "I said, are you coming to the library, or are you going to stare a hole through the Slytherin table all morning?" Ginny's tone was teasing, but her eyes were sharp. She noticed too much. "I wasn't staring," Hermione lied smoothly, buttering a scone with unnecessary force. "I was just thinking about the arithmancy essay." "Right," Ginny said, not buying it for a second. The library was a sanctuary of dust and silence, a place where the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the quiet scratching of quills. It was late afternoon, and the autumn light was filtering through the high windows in long, golden shafts, illuminating the dancing motes of dust. Draco sat at a secluded table in the back, buried behind a stack of advanced potion texts. He wasn't reading. He was staring at the same paragraph he had been looking at for 20 minutes, the letters swimming before his eyes. He was exhausted. The effort of maintaining the walls was draining him. Every time he entered a room, he scanned for her. It was involuntary, a reflex he couldn't curse out of his system. He needed to know where she was. He told himself it was strategic. Know your enemy. But he knew it was a lie. He heard the distinctive sound of books being slammed onto a table nearby. He didn't turn his head, but his body went rigid. She was 2 tables away. He could see her profile through the gap in the shelves. She was alone, surrounded by a fortress of books, her hair a chaotic halo in the dying light. She looked fierce. She looked tired. He watched her dip her quill into the ink pot. She bit her lip as she wrote, a habit he had catalogued along with a dozen others. The way she tapped her foot when she was impatient, the way she sighed when she found a translation error. He hated that he knew these things. He hated that she was the only technicolor thing in his monochrome world. A shadow fell across his table. Malfoy. Draco didn't look up immediately. He finished turning the page, then slowly raised his eyes. Theodore Nott was standing there, looking bored, flanked by 2 younger Slytherins, 6th years who looked like they were trying too hard to emulate the cruelty of a war they hadn't really fought in. "Nott," Draco acknowledged, his voice cool. "We're heading to Hogsmeade. Grab a drink," Theo said. It wasn't really an invitation. It was a summons. The pureblood hierarchy was in shambles, but old habits died hard. "Busy," Draco murmured, gesturing vaguely to the books. One of the 6th years, a boy named Bowl with a thick neck and dull eyes, snickered. His gaze drifted past Draco, through the shelves, and landed on Hermione. "Working hard, or just trying to look busy so the mudblood doesn't show you up again?" Bowles sneered. The word was quiet, but in the hush of the library it carried like a gunshot. Draco's hand froze on the page. The air around the table temperature dropped. Theo looked at Draco, his eyes narrowing slightly, sensing the shift. Hermione had heard it. Draco saw her back stiffen. She didn't turn around. She didn't reach for her wand. She simply stopped writing, her quill hovering over the parchment, a statue of dignified restraint. Bowl, emboldened by the lack of reaction, took a step toward Hermione's table. "Hey, Granger," he whispered, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "They let you touch the restricted books now. Thought they'd be worried you'd dirty them." He reached out and shoved the stack of books on the edge of her table. It was a petty, childish act. The heavy, leather-bound tomes toppled over with a loud, clattering crash that echoed through the library like thunder. Madame Pince shushed them from somewhere in the distance, but didn't appear. Hermione flinched. Ink splattered across her essay, hours of work ruined in a second. She stared at the black stains spreading across the parchment, her hands curling into fists on the table. She didn't look at the boy. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Bowl laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Oops, clumsy." Draco was moving before he had made the conscious decision to stand. There was no sound of a chair scraping. One moment he was seated, the next he was standing directly behind Bowl. He didn't draw his wand. He didn't need to. He radiated a cold, malevolent authority that had been bred into him for generations. "Pick them up," Draco said. His voice was terrifyingly soft. It was the voice of Lucius Malfoy, stripped of the theatrics and left with only the razor-sharp edge of intent. Bowles spun around, startled. He looked at Draco, confusion warring with bravado on his face. "What?" "The books," Draco said, his grey eyes boring into the younger boy's skull. "Pick them up, now." "But, Draco, it's just Granger. It's just a—" "I don't care who it is," Draco cut him off. He took a single step closer, invading the boy's personal space. He looked down his nose at Bowl, his expression one of utter, withering distaste. You're making a scene. You're being loud, and you're being boring. It's pedestrian, Bowl. It's beneath us. He didn't defend Hermione. He didn't act the hero. He framed the cruelty as a breach of etiquette, a failure of class. But the threat underlying the words was unmistakable. Touch her again, and I will end you. Bowles swallowed hard. He looked at Theo for support, but Nott was just watching Draco with a raised eyebrow, a mixture of surprise and calculation on his face. Flushing red, Bowle bent down. He scrambled to stack the books back onto the table, his movements jerky and humiliated. Hermione watched him, her expression unreadable, her chest rising and falling rapidly. When the last book was placed, Bowle retreated, muttering under his breath, scurrying away like a kicked dog. Theo gave Draco a long, searching look, then shrugged and followed the younger boy. Silence reclaimed the space. Draco stood there for a moment, adjusting his cuffs, smoothing the invisible wrinkles in his robes. He looked annoyed, like someone who had just been forced to deal with a tedious administrative error. He turned to go back to his seat. Malfoy. Her voice stopped him. It was steady, though he could hear the tremor buried deep within it. Draco paused, his back to her. He didn't turn around. You didn't have to do that, she said. He turned his head slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. The golden light caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. He looked cold, distant, miles away from the man who had held her on the roof. I like this table, he said flatly. I prefer it quiet. He was disturbing the peace. He ruined my essay, she said, gesturing to the ink-stained parchment. She wasn't complaining. She was stating a fact, probing for a reaction. Draco's eyes flicked to the ruined work, then back to her face. For a split second, the mask slipped. His eyes softened, a flicker of genuine regret passing through the grey. He looked at her hands, which were trembling slightly. Then write a better one, he said. It was harsh. It was dismissive. But then, he did something he had never done before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. It was a potion for ink removal. High quality, expensive, something only a perfectionist would carry. He didn't hand it to her. He set it down on the edge of the nearest shelf, the glass clicking softly against the wood. Don't read into it, Granger, he warned, his voice low. I just can't stand the smell of cheap ink. He turned and walked away, his robes sweeping the floor, leaving her alone in the golden dust. Hermione sat there, her heart pounding in her ears. She looked at the retreating figure of the boy who had been her tormentor for 7 years. Then she looked at the vial on the shelf. She reached out and took it. The glass was still warm from his pocket. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a declaration. But as she uncorked the vial and watched the magical liquid erase the stain, leaving the parchment pristine and ready for new words, she knew what it was. It was a truce. Across the room, Draco sat back down at his table. He didn't look at her again. He stared at his book, his hands shaking slightly beneath the table. He felt sick. He felt exhilarated. He had crossed a line. He had intervened. He had protected her in the light of day, where anyone could see. The seesaw in his chest tipped again. Reluctant respect bloomed in the space where hatred used to be. He respected her silence. He respected that she hadn't thanked him. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if Bowle had touched her, he would have done far worse than just use words. He was in deep water now, and the shore was getting further and further away. The library, on a Saturday night, was a hollowed-out beast, its ribcage of shelves stretching up into the gloom, breathing dust and silence. Most of the school was in Hogsmeade, drinking butterbeer and pretending the world hadn't ended and restarted 2 years ago. But for the ghosts of the 8th year, the festive atmosphere of the 3 broomsticks was suffocating. Hermione sat in her usual alcove, the one hidden behind the restricted section where the shadows were deepest. Her arithmancy chart was spread out before her, a complex web of numbers that refused to align. The rain, which had been threatening for days, was now hammering against the high stained glass windows, a relentless rhythm that usually soothed her. Tonight, it just felt like the castle was weeping. She wasn't alone. 3 tables away, illuminated by a single hovering candle, sat Draco. He had been there when she arrived. He hadn't looked up. He hadn't moved. He was staring at a piece of parchment, his quill hovering motionless over the paper. The ink had likely dried on the nib an hour ago. The dynamic between them had shifted since the incident with Bowl. The air didn't crackle with hostility anymore. It hummed with a strange, heavy awareness. The glass vial of ink remover sat on the corner of Hermione's desk, a small, tangible proof that the lines of engagement had blurred. Hermione looked at the vial, then at him. The silence was becoming loud. It was a physical thing, pressing against her temples. She couldn't focus on the numbers when the equation of him was sitting unsolved a few yards away. She made a decision. She capped her ink, the soft clink sounding like a gavel in the quiet room. She stood up. Draco didn't flinch, but his shoulders tensed. He knew she was moving. He knew she was coming. Hermione walked the short distance to his table. She didn't stop until she was standing at the edge of his candlelight. Up close, he looked worse than he had on the tower. The grey of his eyes seemed to have bled into the skin beneath them. There was a fine tremor in his hand that he was trying to hide by gripping the edge of the table. "You're not writing," she said softly. Draco slowly lifted his head. His expression was guarded, a fortress of exhaustion. "And you're not studying, Granger. You've been staring at the same page for 45 minutes. I can hear you thinking. It's loud." "I wanted to thank you," she said, ignoring the barb, "for the other day, with Bowl." Draco sneered, but it lacked heat. It was a reflex, a muscle memory of a defense mechanism. "I told you, I dislike noise. Bowl is a loud, incompetent idiot. It was an aesthetic decision, not a moral one." "It was a decent one," Hermione corrected, stepping closer. She pulled out the chair opposite him. She didn't ask for permission. She sat down. Draco looked at her as if she had just grown a second head. "What are you doing?" "Sitting," she said simply. "The light is better over here." "The light is exactly the same everywhere in this godforsaken room," he snapped, but he didn't tell her to leave. He looked down at his blank parchment, his jaw working. "You shouldn't be seen sitting with me. It ruins your brand. The Golden Girl and the Death Eater. It's bad PR." "I don't care about PR, Malfoy. I care about the fact that you look like you haven't slept in a week." "I sleep fine," he lied, the falsehood so transparent it was almost insulting. "No, you don't," Hermione said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt intimate in the vast, empty library. "I see you walking the corridors at 3 a.m. I see you on the tower. I see you here, hiding from the common room because you can't stand the way the first years look at you. Draco's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with sudden raw anger. And how do they look at me, Granger? Go on, say it. Like a monster, she said quietly. The air left the space between them. Draco flinched as if she had slapped him. He looked away, staring into the darkness of the shelves. Precisely. So why are you sitting here? Did you come to gloat? To study the specimen up close? No, Hermione said, feeling a sudden surge of boldness. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the table, palm up, an offering. I came because I know what it's like to be looked at. They look at me like a hero, Draco. But they don't see me either. They see a statue, a symbol. They don't see the girl who obliterated her parents' memories. They don't see the panic attacks. Draco looked at her hand, then at her face. The use of his first name hung in the air, vibrating. He looked stunned. You kept your parents safe, he said, his voice rough. I erased myself from their lives, she countered, the pain of it still fresh, a wound that wouldn't close. I made myself an orphan to save them. It doesn't feel like heroism, Draco. It feels like mutilation. Draco was silent for a long time. The rain battered the glass. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across his pale features. He looked at her with a new expression, not pity, but recognition. It was the look of one soldier seeing the scars on another. I didn't have a choice, he whispered finally. The confession was dragged out of him, a stone pulled from a deep well. 6th year, the tower. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want him to kill my mother. Hermione felt her heart squeeze. She remembered Dumbledore falling. She remembered the hatred she had felt for the boy on the tower. But looking at him now, seeing the haunted wreck of a young man who had been a pawn in a game of giants, the hatred evaporated. I know, she said. You don't, he argued, shaking his head. He pulled his left arm off the table, tucking it into his lap, hiding it. You were on the right side. You bled for the right cause. I have this. He didn't show it, but the gesture was enough. The dark mark, the brand that would never fade. Hermione looked at him steadily. She slowly rolled up the sleeve of her left arm. She extended it across the table, turning her wrist so the scarred skin caught the candlelight. Mud blood. Draco stared at it. His breath hitched. He looked at the jagged silver letters carved into her skin. He looked at it with a mixture of horror and fascination. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering inches above her arm, but he didn't touch it. He looked like he was afraid he would burn her. I watched, he choked out. In the drawing room, I stood there and I watched. I know, Hermione repeated. I saw you. I wanted to do something, he said, his voice cracking. I wanted to stop her, but I was a coward. You were a child, Draco, Hermione said, firm, her voice cutting through his self-flagellation. We were children, and we were terrified. She didn't pull her arm away. She let him look. She let him see the ugliness of it, because in showing him her scar, she was acknowledging his. It doesn't go away, he murmured, his eyes still fixed on the word. The guilt, it's heavy. No, she agreed. It doesn't go away, but you don't have to carry it alone. Draco looked up at her then. His eyes were wet. The walls were down. The arrogant, pure-blood prince was gone. In his place was just a boy who was drowning, and she had just thrown him a line. Why? He asked, searching her face. Why are you doing this? After everything I called you, after everything I did. Hermione thought about it. She thought about the anger she had carried for years. She thought about the war. And then she thought about the rooftop and the way he had held her when she almost fell. Because the war is over, she said softly, and I'm tired of fighting Draco. Aren't you? He looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, slowly, he exhaled. It was a long, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it for 2 years. Yes, he whispered. I am tired. He didn't smile. It wasn't a happy moment. It was a heavy, solemn moment. But it was real. He reached into his bag and pulled out a fresh quill. He dipped it into the ink pot. He didn't look at her, but he shifted his parchment slightly, angling his body toward her rather than away. You have a rounding error in the 3rd line of your arithmancy chart, he said, his voice low, returning to a semblance of his usual drawl, but softer. The planetary alignment for Mars is negative in this quadrant. Hermione blinked, surprised. She looked down at her chart. He was right. Oh, she said. She looked up at him. Thank you. Don't mention it, he muttered, focusing on his own work. I can't concentrate with you sighing over incorrect calculations. It's distracting. Hermione felt a small, genuine smile tug at the corner of her mouth. She picked up her quill. They worked in silence for the rest of the night. But it wasn't the empty, echoing silence of before. It was a companionable silence. The silence of 2 people who had seen the worst of each other and decided to stay seated anyway. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the castle walls. But inside the circle of candlelight, for the first time in a long time, the cold didn't feel quite so biting. As the curfew bell tolled in the distance, signaling the end of the night, Hermione began to pack her bag. Draco did the same. They stood up together. They didn't walk back to the dorms together. That would be too much, too soon. But as they reached the heavy oak doors of the library, Draco paused. He held the door open, waiting for her to pass. Hermione stopped. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with a strange intensity, his grey eyes searching hers. Good night, Granger, he said. Good night, Draco, she replied. He didn't flinch at the name this time. He just nodded, a sharp jerk of his chin, and turned toward the dungeons. Hermione watched him go, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. The truce was fragile. It was made of glass. But as she walked back to Gryffindor Tower, she realized that glass, when treated with care, could be the strongest thing in the world. She touched her left arm, tracing the scar through her sleeve. It still hurt, but tonight it hurt a little less. Winter arrived at Hogwarts not with a whisper, but with a snap. Over the course of a single night, the damp, weeping autumn was strangled by a hard, glittering frost that coated every stone, every pane of glass, and every blade of grass on the grounds. The castle, usually a sanctuary, transformed into a fortress of ice. The corridors drafted with a biting chill that no warming charm could fully penetrate, and the breath of the students hung in the air like suspended ghosts. For Hermione, the cold was internal. It had been 2 days since the library, 2 days since the truce, since the bearing of scars, since the quiet acknowledgement of shared trauma. She had woken up the morning after feeling a strange, tentative hope. It wasn't love. She wasn't naive enough to call it that yet. But it was a crack in the dam. a possibility. She had walked to breakfast with a lighter step, half expecting a nod, a look, something to confirm that the tectonic plates of their relationship had shifted. Instead, she hit a wall of ice. Draco hadn't looked at her in the Great Hall. He hadn't looked at her in potions. He hadn't looked at her in the corridors. It wasn't the passive ignoring of before. This was active. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. When she had entered a room, he had turned his back. When she had passed him on the stairs, he had stared through her as if she were made of glass. Now, standing in the frosty courtyard during a free period, clutching her cloak tight around her throat, Hermione felt the sting of humiliation burn behind her eyes. She felt foolish. Stupid Granger, she chided herself, watching her breath mist in the freezing air. You let your guard down. You thought a few shared nightmares and a moment of vulnerability changed 7 years of history. She saw him then. He was standing near the stone archway that led to the dungeons, leaning against a pillar. He wasn't alone. Blaise Zabini was with him, talking in low tones, laughing at something dark. Draco wasn't laughing. He looked severe, his face pale and sharp as a blade, his eyes fixed on the grey horizon. He looked like the Malfoy of old, untouchable, superior, cold. Hermione should have turned around. She should have walked back to the warmth of the Gryffindor common room and buried herself in a book. But the memory of his trembling hand hovering over her scar wouldn't let her go. She knew what she had seen. She knew he wasn't this stone statue he was pretending to be. She walked across the courtyard. The crunch of her boots on the frozen grass was loud in the stillness. Zabini saw her first. He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips, but he said nothing. He simply nudged Draco. Draco turned. His eyes landed on her, and for a second Hermione saw a flash of something frantic, panic, regret, before the shutters slammed down. The grey eyes went flat and dead. "Granger," Zabini drawled, breaking the silence. "Come to deduct points, or just to ruin the view?" "I need to speak to Malfoy," Hermione said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She didn't look at Blaise. She kept her gaze pinned on Draco. "Alone." Zabini let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked at Draco. "She needs to speak to you. Alone. Since when are you on a first-name basis with the Gryffindor princess?" Draco didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his hands deep in the pockets of his expensive black wool coat. He looked at Hermione with an expression of profound boredom. "I have nothing to say to you, Granger," he said. His voice was smooth, cool, and utterly detached. "I think you do," Hermione challenged, stepping closer. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she ignored it. "In the library, the other night, you said—" "I was tired," Draco cut her off. The words were sharp, precise. "And I was bored. Do not mistake a moment of weakness for a change in disposition." Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. "Weakness," she repeated, her voice dropping. "You think showing humanity is weakness?" "I think forgetting your place is a weakness," he sneered. It was a clumsy insult, a retread of old material, but it landed. "And I certainly think forgetting who I am is a sign of declining intelligence, even for you." Zabini chuckled darkly, enjoying the show. Hermione felt a flash of hot anger mix with the hurt. "I know who you are, Draco. I saw you. I saw the person who saved me on the tower. I saw the person who hates the mark on his arm. Draco's face contorted. The mask cracked, revealing a flash of terrifying rage. He pushed off the pillar, taking 2 aggressive strides toward her until he was towering over her. He lowered his voice to a hiss, so low that Zabini couldn't hear. "You saw what you wanted to see," he spat. "You saw a project, a broken bird you could fix to make yourself feel better about the war. You want redemption, Granger? Go find it somewhere else. I don't want your pity, and I certainly don't want your friendship." "It wasn't pity," she whispered, her eyes searching his, looking for the lie. "It was understanding." "Then you understand nothing," he snapped. The cruelty in his eyes was deliberate now, wielded like a weapon. "Look at me. I am a Malfoy. I am a Death Eater. I stood by and watched you scream in my house. That is the reality. That is the truth. Anything else is a delusion you've conjured up because you can't stand the silence of your own life." He leaned in closer, his breath cold against her cheek. "Stay away from me, Granger, for your own good. If you think I'm safe, you're an idiot. And if you think I care about you, you're mad." He pulled back sharply, adjusting his coat with a jerk. He looked at her with a final withering glance, a look designed to maim. "Come on, Blaze," he said to Zabini. "It smells like self-righteousness out here." He turned on his heel and walked away, his robes swirling in the freezing wind. He didn't look back. Hermione stood frozen in the courtyard. The cold seeped through her cloak, through her skin, settling deep in her marrow. She felt stripped raw. The rejection wasn't just a refusal of friendship. It was a denial of the reality they had shared. He was gaslighting her. He was telling her that the intimacy, the tension, the connection, it was all in her head. She watched his retreating back until he disappeared into the shadows of the castle. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. But inside, something fragile that had begun to unfurl in her chest withered and died. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, her jaw set, her walls slamming back up, higher and thicker than before. Draco didn't stop walking until he reached the sanctuary of the boys' bathroom on the 6th floor. He pushed the door open, checked that it was empty, and then moved to the farthest sink. He gripped the porcelain with both hands, hanging his head, his chest heaving as if he had just run a mile. He felt sick, physically, violently sick. The look on her face, the hurt, the confusion, the way the light had died in her eyes when he called her delusional. It was burned into his retinas. "You had to," he gasped to the empty room. "You had to do it." He splashed cold water on his face, trying to shock the nausea away. He looked at himself in the mirror. He looked pale, ghostly, a liar. He hadn't meant a word of it. He didn't think she was a project. He didn't think she was delusional. He didn't think showing humanity was weakness. He thought she was dangerous. She was dangerous because she made him feel. She made him want. She made him imagine a future where he wasn't just a pariah, a relic of a dark time. And that hope was a guillotine waiting to drop. If he let her in, he would ruin her. It was a mathematical certainty. The Ministry was watching him. The remaining pure-blood fanatics despised him as a traitor. The light side tolerated him barely. If Hermione Granger, the Golden Girl, lowered herself to be with him, she would be dragged down into the mud alongside him. Her reputation, her future, her light, all of it would be tarnished by his touch. He was poison. He had told her that on the tower, and she hadn't listened. So he had to show her. He had to be the monster she expected. It was the only way to make her hate him. And she had to hate him. Hate was safe. Hate was a barrier that would keep her far away from the wreckage of his life. "It's better this way," he whispered, his voice trembling. He traced the line of his jaw, remembering the ghost of her gaze. He remembered how she had looked at his arm in the library, not with disgust, but with a sorrow that mirrored his own. He wanted to go back. He wanted to run after her, grab her hand, and apologize until his voice gave out. He wanted to tell her that she was the only thing that made the cold bearable. He wanted to tell her that he was terrified, not of her, but of himself. But he couldn't. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the occlumency shields to slam down. He visualized a wall of black ice. He packed the memory of her hurt face into a box and shoved it into the deepest, darkest corner of his mind. He straightened up. He adjusted his collar. He smoothed his hair. When he opened his eyes, the panic was gone, replaced by a dull, aching emptiness. The Malfoy mask was back in place. He walked out of the bathroom and into the corridor. The castle was freezing, the air biting at his exposed skin. He walked with his head high, his expression imperious, terrified that if he stopped moving, even for a second, the frost inside him would shatter and he would never be able to put himself back together again. That evening, the great hall was warm, lit by thousands of floating candles. But the atmosphere at the Gryffindor table was subdued. Hermione sat with a book open next to her plate, but she wasn't reading. She was staring at the text, the letters blurring into nonsense. "Hermione," Harry asked gently, "you okay? You've barely touched your dinner." "I'm fine," she said, her voice brittle. "Just tired. The cold is draining." She glanced up, her eyes involuntarily darting across the hall. The Slytherin table was raucous. Draco was holding court. He was sitting in the center of a group of seventh years, a goblet of pumpkin juice in his hand. He was laughing, a sharp, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. He looked relaxed. He looked arrogant. He looked perfectly, completely fine. He didn't look at her, not once. Hermione felt a cold bitterness settle in her stomach. She closed her book with a snap. "I'm going to bed," she announced, standing up. "But dessert hasn't even arrived," Ron protested. "I'm not hungry," she said. She walked out of the great hall, her head held high. She didn't look back at the Slytherin table. She didn't see Draco's hand tighten around his goblet until the metal warped. She didn't see the way his laughter cut off the moment she disappeared from view. She walked through the corridors, the stone walls radiating a chill that felt personal. She had been right to be afraid. She'd been right to keep her distance. Trust is a luxury, she thought, the words echoing the lessons of the war. And I just went bankrupt. She reached the portrait of the fat lady, gave the password Glacius, and climbed into the common room. She went straight to her dormitory, drew the curtains of her bed, and cast a silencing charm. Only then, in the absolute dark, did she let the first tear fall. It was hot and angry, tracking a path down her cold cheek. She wiped it away furiously. She wouldn't cry for him. She wouldn't feel for him. If he wanted ice, she would give him winter. But as she lay there, listening to the wind howl against the tower, she couldn't shake the memory of the library, the quiet, the understanding. The feeling of two lonely people finding a moment of peace. Was it all a lie? Or was this, the cruelty, the distance, the mask, the lie? She didn't know which was worse, being played for a fool or knowing that he was hurting himself just to hurt her. Outside, the snow began to fall, burying the castle in white, covering the tracks of everyone who walked the grounds, erasing the path between them until it was gone. The sub-archives were less a library and more a graveyard of forgotten magic. Located 3 levels beneath the dungeons, the air here was so old it tasted metallic, thick with the dust of centuries and the heavy, static charge of enchantments that had long since curdled. Hermione sneezed, the sound echoing sharply in the cramped circular room. The space was filled floor to ceiling with narrow shelves packed with rotting scrolls and leather-bound records that hadn't seen the light of day since the Goblin Rebellions. A single enchanted lantern on the central desk cast a dim, flickering amber light, throwing long skeletal shadows against the curved stone walls. She was not alone, unfortunately. On the other side of the central desk, Draco Malfoy was sorting through a stack of blackened parchment. He was working with a mechanical, rigid efficiency, placing scroll after scroll into a preservation box without reading them. He hadn't looked at her once in the 2 hours they had been down here. It was a punishment detail, or restorative duty, as McGonagall called it. Organizing the deepest archives was a task reserved for students who needed character building, or in this case, a head girl and a returning 8th year who just happened to be available on a Friday evening. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't the companionable silence of the library a week ago. This was a weaponized silence. It was the icy wall Draco had erected in the courtyard, reinforced with steel. Hermione grabbed a heavy ledger, slamming it down on the desk with unnecessary force. Dust motes danced in the lantern light. Draco didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just reached for another scroll. "Are you going to keep this up?" Hermione asked, her voice tight. "Pretending I don't exist?" Draco paused, his hand hovering over the parchment. He looked at the scroll, not her. "I am working, Granger. I suggest you do the same. This air is foul, and I'd like to finish before I suffocate." "You were the one who started talking in the courtyard," she pressed, the hurt from 2 days ago flaring up into a hot, bright anger. "You called me delusional. You said I was a project." "I said a lot of things," he drawled, his voice bored, though she noticed the muscle feathering in his jaw. "I'm surprised you remember them. Usually you only memorize textbooks." "Don't do that," she snapped. "Don't hide behind the snobbery. It's a cheap trick, Draco." At the sound of his name, his head snapped up. His eyes were cold, hard chips of flint. "It's Malfoy, and it's not a trick. It's a reality check. Now, hand me the preservation fluid." He reached out his hand, palm open, expecting obedience. Hermione stared at him. She stared at the pale hand that had held her on the tower. She stared at the face that had looked so broken in the moonlight. She hated him in that moment. She hated him for making her care, and she hated him for throwing it back in her face. She reached for the heavy glass bottle of fluid, but instead of handing it to him, she set it down on her side of the table with a decisive thud. "Get it yourself," she said. Draco's eyes narrowed. He looked at the bottle, then at her. A spark of genuine irritation finally broke through his apathy. He walked around the edge of the desk, his movements sharp and aggressive. He invaded her space, reaching for the bottle. As he grabbed it, the hem of his robe caught on the rusted iron latch of a heavy archival chest on the floor. He tugged. The chest shifted. Click. The sound was small, but the result was catastrophic. The heavy iron door to the archive, the only exit, slammed shut with a boom that shook the dust from the ceiling. The sound of intricate, heavy tumblers falling into place echoed through the stone. Thud, thud, click. Draco froze. He looked at the door. "What did you do?" he hissed. "Me?" Hermione cried, incredulous. "You kicked the chest." Draco abandoned the bottle and lunged for the door. He grabbed the iron ring handle and pulled. It didn't budge. He pulled again, bracing his foot against the frame, straining until the veins in his neck stood out. It was sealed solid. "Alohomora!" he barked, pointing his wand at the keyhole. Nothing. The spell fizzled and died against the wood, absorbed by the ancient protective wards of the room. "It's the containment protocol," Hermione realized, horror dawning on her. She rushed to the door, running her hands over the cold iron. The archives, if they detect a threat or a disturbance, they seal to protect the documents. It's old magic, elemental. "I am not a threat," Draco shouted at the door, kicking it. "Open, you blasted piece of rot!" "Stop it!" Hermione grabbed his arm to pull him back. "You're making it worse. It reacts to aggression." He spun on her, wrenching his arm from her grip. The movement was violent, fueled by panic and the claustrophobia that was clearly clawing at his throat. The room was small, too small for two people who were currently at war. "Don't touch me," he snarled, backing her up until her hips hit the edge of the central desk. "This is your fault. If you hadn't been so desperate for a conversation." "My fault?" Hermione's voice rose an octave. "You're the one who's been acting like a petulant child for days, walking around like a tragic hero, pushing everyone away." "I am pushing you away," he roared, the sound deafening in the small space. "Because you don't know when to stop. You don't know when to leave well enough alone." "Because I know you're lying," she shouted back, stepping into him, refusing to be cowed. She was inches from him now, looking up into his furious face. "I know you, Draco. I know you're not this cruel, heartless Death Eater you're pretending to be. I felt your hands on me. I saw your eyes. You saw nothing. I saw you. Then you're blind." He slammed his hands onto the desk on either side of her, trapping her. He leaned down, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and agony. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving against his robes. The air between them was electric, crackling with the scent of ozone and old dust. "Why won't you let it go?" he whispered harshly, his voice breaking on the last word. "Why do you insist on digging? There is nothing here, Granger. Just rot, just ruin." "Because I don't believe that," she whispered back. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She looked right into the grey storm of his eyes. "And neither do you." Draco stared at her. The anger was still there, but beneath it the foundation was crumbling. He looked trapped, not just in the room, but in his own skin. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes, then her mouth again. "You are infuriating," he breathed. "You are the most stubborn, impossible witch." "And you are a coward," she said softly. It was the final straw. Draco let out a sound that was half groan, half growl. He didn't pull away. He didn't insult her. He crashed into her. His hands left the desk and tangled into her hair, gripping her scalp with a desperation that bordered on pain. He pulled her head back and brought his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was a collision. It was the breaking of a dam. Hermione gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to clutch at the lapels of his robes, pulling him closer. His lips were hot, rough, moving against hers with a starving intensity. There was no technique, no gentleness. It was messy and frantic and overwhelming. It was an argument continued in a different language. He kissed her like he was angry at her for making him want this. He kissed her like he was drowning, and she was the only air left in the world. Hermione opened to him, meeting his intensity with her own. She poured all the frustration, the confusion, and the longing of the last few weeks into the kiss. She pressed her body against his, needing to feel the solidity of him, needing to prove that he was real, that this was real. Draco groaned into her mouth, the sound vibrating through her chest. He walked her backward, pressing her harder against the edge of the desk, his hips grinding against hers. The sensation sent a jolt of pure heat straight to her core. His hands roamed, desperate to touch. One hand slid down her back, gripping her waist, his thumb digging into her side. The other was still in her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss, to devour her. "Hermione!" He gasped against her lips, the name torn from his throat. Hearing him say her name, stripped of all irony and malice, broke something inside her. She softened. Her hands moved up his chest, wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in the silky hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss changed. The frantic energy bled away, replaced by a slow, burning intensity. It became deeper, wetter, more searching. Draco's grip on her waist loosened, his touch becoming a caress. He tasted of mint and desperation. He pulled back just an inch, their foreheads resting together, their breathing ragged and synchronized in the quiet room. His eyes were closed, his lashes fluttering against his pale cheeks. "I tried," he whispered, his voice wrecked. "I tried to make you hate me." "I know," Hermione whispered back, running her thumb along his jawline. His skin was burning. "I'm poison, Hermione," he said, opening his eyes. The grey was dark, dilated, full of fear. "I ruin things. If you stay close to me, I will drag you down." "You're not poison," she said fiercely, shaking her head. "You're just broken, and so am I." "You're the golden girl," he argued weakly, though he didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch. "I'm just a girl," she corrected. "I'm just a girl who is locked in a basement with the only person who understands why I can't sleep at night." Draco looked at her, really looked at her, with a vulnerability that stole the breath from her lungs. The walls were gone. The ice had melted. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed. It was a surrender. "Since the tower, every time I close my eyes, you're there. It's maddening." "Me too," she admitted. "I see you everywhere." He let out a shaky breath and leaned in again, brushing his lips against hers, softly this time, a question rather than a demand. "This is a mistake," he murmured against her mouth. "Probably," she agreed. "We're going to regret this in the morning." "Maybe." "Kiss me again," he commanded softly. Hermione didn't need to be told twice. She closed the gap, and this time the kiss was slow. It was a savoring. It was a study of texture and taste. Draco's arms wrapped around her completely, enveloping her in his scent and his warmth, shielding her from the cold damp of the archives. For a long time, there was no sound in the room, but the rustle of robes and the soft sighs of two people finding sanctuary in each other. The ancient magic of the room seemed to settle. The lantern light flickered, casting a warm glow over them. Draco lifted her easily, setting her onto the edge of the desk so they were eye to level. He stepped between her knees, his hands resting on her thighs, his thumbs tracing lazy circles on the fabric of her skirt. He looked at her with a wonder that made her heart ache. "You're beautiful," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue, as if he was surprised by them himself. "It's annoying." Hermione laughed, a breathless, watery sound. "You're not so bad yourself, Malfoy." "Don't get used to it," he smirked, but the smile reached his eyes. It was the first real smile she had ever seen on him. It transformed his face, taking years off his age, making him look like the boy he should have been if the world hadn't intruded. He leaned his forehead against hers again. "What do we do now?" "We wait," Hermione said, resting her hands on his shoulders. "Someone will realize we're gone, eventually." "I hope they take their time," Draco muttered, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He kissed the sensitive skin below her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "Draco," she warned, her voice trembling. "Just waiting," he mumbled against her skin. "Efficient use of time." Hermione closed her eyes, leaning back, her hands tightening in his hair. The archives were still cold. The door was still locked. The war was still a fresh memory, and the world outside was still complicated and cruel. But in here, in the dim amber light, wrapped in the arms of the boy who had once been her enemy, Hermione Granger felt warmer than she had in years. The emotional seesaw had finally stopped, balancing perfectly on this fragile, terrifying, wonderful moment of peace. She felt passion, yes, but she didn't feel like she was going mad. For the first time, she felt entirely, completely sane. The click of the archive door unsealing was not a triumphant sound. It was a jarring, mechanical intrusion that shattered the suspended reality of the last hour. The heavy iron tumblers groaned, the ancient magic sensing that the threat, or perhaps just the overwhelming emotional turbulence, had subsided enough to release its prisoners. Hermione flinched. The sound was like a bucket of ice water, shocking her back into her own skin. Draco moved instantly. The fluidity with which he disentangled himself from her was terrifying. One moment, he was warm, solid, and desperate against her. The next, he was 3 feet away, his back to her, straightening his collar with trembling fingers. The loss of his heat was a physical blow. The lantern on the desk flickered and died, plunging them back into the gloom of the dungeon level. "The door," Draco rasped. His voice was unrecognizable, stripped of its drawl, stripped of its polish. It sounded like gravel. "Right," Hermione whispered. She hopped off the desk, her legs feeling unsteady, like she had just disembarked from a long voyage at sea. She smoothed her skirt, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to stop it. She looked at his back. He was rigid. The tension had returned to his shoulders, that familiar, burdened hunch that looked like he was carrying the ceiling of the castle. "Draco?" she asked, the name feeling illicit in the open air. He didn't turn around. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect platinum strands, then immediately smoothed them back down. He was rebuilding the Malfoy armor piece by piece, second by second. "Go," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Go before Filch comes on his rounds, or a prefect, or anyone. Hermione hesitated. The logical part of her brain knew he was right. Being caught here, dishevelled, with swollen lips and flushed skin, would be a scandal that neither of them needed. But the emotional part of her, the part that was still humming with the electricity of his touch, wanted to scream. She wanted him to turn around. She wanted him to acknowledge that the axis of the world had just tilted. "Are we?" she started, her voice small. What was this? Draco finally turned. In the shadows of the open door, his face was a pale blur, but his eyes caught the faint light from the corridor torches. They weren't cold anymore. They were wide, dark, and filled with a profound, terrifying uncertainty. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring at the drop, wondering if the fall would kill him or set him free. "I don't know," he confessed, the honesty brutal. "I don't know, Granger." He didn't step toward her. He didn't reach for her. He looked at her hands, then her mouth, and a muscle in his jaw jumped. "Go to bed," he whispered. It felt like a dismissal. It felt like the closing of a book. Hermione nodded, her throat tight. She grabbed her bag, the strap digging into her shoulder. She walked past him, and for a fleeting second, their arms brushed, wool against silk. The spark was still there, a static shock that made them both inhale sharply. She stepped out into the corridor. The air was freezing. She didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see him walking away in the opposite direction, descending further into the dark while she climbed toward the tower. The walk back to Gryffindor Tower was a blur of stone and shadows. Hermione moved on autopilot, her body present, but her mind stuck in the loop of the last hour. The taste of mint, the roughness of his hands, the way he had said, "You're beautiful," as if it were an accusation. By the time she reached her dormitory, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, gnawing anxiety. She changed into her nightdress in the dark, moving quietly so as not to wake Ginny or Parvati. She slipped under the heavy quilt, pulling it up to her chin, staring at the canopy above. The silence of the room was oppressive. Now came the doubt. The seesaw tipped violently back toward fear. Was it just the adrenaline? The claustrophobia? Had they just been two desperate people seeking comfort in the dark? She thought of the way he had pulled away the moment the door opened, the way he had rebuilt his walls. Tomorrow, in the harsh light of day, would he regret it? Would he look at her with that cold, sneering indifference? Would he pretend it never happened? The thought made her chest ache with a physical, sharp pain. She realized, with a sudden, sinking clarity, that she didn't just want the kiss. She wanted him. She wanted the broken, sarcastic, brilliant, damaged boy who hid behind the mask. And the terrifying possibility that she might have just been a momentary lapse in judgment for him kept her awake until the sky outside the window began to turn a bruised purple. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and thin. Hermione woke with a start, her heart pounding, the morning light streaming through the gaps in the velvet curtains. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then the memories rushed back, the archives, the kiss, the cold goodbye. She squeezed her eyes shut, groaning into her pillow. She didn't want to get up. She didn't want to face the great hall. She didn't want to see his face and find nothing but marble. "Hermione!" Ginny's voice was sleepy, coming from the next bed. "You awake? It's late. Breakfast is almost over." "I'm up," Hermione croaked. Her voice sounded rusty. She rolled over, intending to push back the curtains and face the day. Then she froze. On the pillow next to her head, resting on the pristine white linen, was a splash of crimson. Hermione blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, a hallucination born of wishful thinking. She reached out a tentative hand. It was real. A single, long-stemmed rose lay on the pillow. It wasn't a transfigured quill or a clumsy charm. It was a real, living flower. The petals were a deep, velvety red, so dark they were almost black at the edges, the colour of dried blood, or perhaps the colour of a Gryffindor lion drowning in Slytherin shadows. It was stripped of thorns, the stems smooth and green. There was no note, no parchment, no scrawled explanation. Hermione picked it up. The flower was heavy, cool to the touch. As she brought it closer, the scent hit her. Not the cloying, powdery smell of a perfume shop, but a fresh, sharp scent. It smelled of rain. It smelled of ozone. It smelled of cedar. It smelled like him. Her heart performed a complicated gymnastic maneuver in her chest, flipping from dread to a soaring, terrifying hope. He had been here, or he had sent it. How he had gotten it into the Gryffindor girls' dormitory was a mystery. House elves, perhaps, or sheer stubborn Malfoy ingenuity. But the how didn't matter. The why was everything. A rose wasn't a handshake. It wasn't a truce. It wasn't a restorative duty. A rose was a promise. It was an admission. It was the answer to the question he couldn't voice in the corridor. "I don't know," he had said. But this rose said, "I know, I remember, I am not running away." Hermione pressed the cool petals against her cheek, closing her eyes. A smile, slow and genuine, spread across her face. The knot of anxiety in her stomach unravelled, replaced by a warm, golden hum. "Hermione?" Ginny asked again, the rustle of sheets indicating she was sitting up. "What's that?" Hermione quickly tucked the rose under her pillow, hiding it from view. This was hers. It was the only secret she wanted to keep. "Nothing," Hermione said, her voice light, steady, and full of a new, quiet strength. "Just a good dream." The great hall was loud, a cacophony of clattering cutlery and morning chatter. The Sunday mail had just arrived, and owls were swooping overhead, dropping packages and letters. Hermione walked in with Ginny, feeling like she was floating slightly above the flagstones. She felt exposed, yet armoured. She took her seat at the Gryffindor table, pouring herself a cup of tea. Her hands were steady. She didn't look across the hall immediately. She buttered her toast. She added milk to her tea. She breathed in the smell of the castle, toast, wax, and magic. Then, slowly, she raised her eyes. Draco was there. He was sitting in his usual spot, surrounded by the insular bubble of Slytherins. He looked impeccable. His robes were pressed, his hair was sleek, his posture was the epitome of aristocratic indifference. He was listening to Pansy Parkinson, nodding vaguely at whatever she was saying. He looked exactly the same as he always did. Hermione felt a flicker of the old doubt. Had she imagined the rose? Then, as if he felt the weight of her gaze, he stopped nodding. He turned his head. Across the four house tables, across the history of blood and war and prejudice, his eyes met hers. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge her publicly. That would be dangerous. That would be foolish. But his gaze didn't slide away. He held her eyes, steady and intense. And then, with a deliberate slowness, he raised his hand to his neck. His long fingers brushed against his collar, adjusting it slightly. It was the same spot where she had buried her face the night before. It was a signal, a mirror of the memory. His eyes softened, just a fraction, a microscopic crack in the ice that only she was close enough to see. In that grey depth, she saw the storm from the tower, the quiet of the library, and the fire of the archives. She saw the fear, yes, but she also saw the decision. He wasn't looking at the mudblood. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at her. Hermione held his gaze, and the corner of her mouth quirked up, a tiny, private smile that was just for him. Draco's hand lowered. He turned back to his breakfast, picking up his fork. But the stiffness in his shoulders was gone. He looked settled. Hermione turned back to her tea, the warmth spreading from her chest to her fingertips. The rose was safe under her pillow. The war was over. The winter was still freezing the windows, but inside the castle, the ice was breaking. It wouldn't be easy. They were still Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger. There would be fights. There would be whispers. There would be the heavy, dragging weight of their pasts trying to pull them under. But as she took a sip of her tea, Hermione thought about the rose and the boy who had braved the Gryffindor Tower to leave it for her. She wasn't afraid of the storm anymore. She was ready to stand in the rain. "Everything all right?" Harry asked, noticing her expression. Hermione looked at her best friend, then back at the blonde head bowed over his plate across the hall. "Yes, Harry," she said softly, the truth ringing clear in the morning air. I think everything is going to be just fine."
Hi everyone, thank you so much for listening to this story. This story is very special to me. I love writing about Draco and Hermione, but I didn't want a simple love story. I wanted to write about healing. You know, the war changed them. They are both broken, they are both scared. Draco feels guilty, Hermione feels lonely. I think that is why they fit together. They understand each other's pain. For me, the most important part was the silence. The moments on the tower, the quiet in the library. Sometimes you don't need words to say I'm sorry or I see you. I hope you felt their emotions. I hope you felt the cold winter and the warmth of that first kiss. And the rose on the end? That is a symbol. It means that even after a dark time, hope can still grow. Did you like this version of them? Please tell me in the comments. I really want to know your thoughts. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next time.